The alert came at 01:17 hours. In a dimly lit radar station outside Petrozavodsk, a low-priority blip flashed across the screen. It moved fast, barely above treetop level, and vanished within seconds. The technician frowned, tapped the console, and tried to recalibrate. No signature, no transponder, just gone. He marked it as a ghost trace, a routine anomaly caused by fog, weather, or a flock of birds. 6 minutes later, 800 kilometers southwest, another Soviet radar picked up something strange, this time near the Belarus border. Again, fast, silent, and low. No ID, no warning, no sound. Another technician, half awake in his concrete bunker, reached for the red phone, but paused. This wasn't supposed to happen. Soviet airspace, the most fortified sky on Earth, wasn't just defended. It was layered, redundant, and bristling with over 600 radar stations, hundreds of surface-to-air missile sites, and a network of interceptors on constant alert. The system could detect anything. They said from a U.S. bomber at 60,000 feet to a reconnaissance drone flying over Afghanistan. Anything except this. The first emergency scramble order was issued from the Minsk PVO Command Center at 01:42. 2 MiG-23s roared into the night, hunting a phantom no one could see. Controllers triangulated possible vectors. Nothing matched. No confirmation. The fighters returned 40 minutes later, empty and furious. At 00:27, the incident reached Soviet Air Defense Command in Moscow. A full alert was issued. Borders locked down. Missile crews went to readiness status. But the target, the intruder, it was already gone. Later that morning, a reconnaissance team combed through telemetry logs from multiple radar sites. Nothing conclusive. A few brief spikes, a short burst of high-frequency emissions. That was all. But one thing was undeniable. Something or someone had penetrated the Soviet Union's most sensitive air corridor, and no one had seen it coming. In hushed tones, inside sealed rooms, the question rippled across military high command: what flew through our skies last night, and more importantly, how did it get in and out without a trace? It was the first time Soviet commanders would question the one thing they had built their entire security strategy upon: that no foreign aircraft could enter the motherland without being seen. They were wrong, and the sky was no longer theirs. For nearly 3 decades, Soviet air defense strategy had been built on a singular belief: depth was security. The USSR's vast geography, layered with radar sites, anti-aircraft artillery, interceptor airfields, and missile networks, was supposed to make invasion impossible. There were no gaps, no blind spots, only redundancy and reach. At least, that's what the map said. Inside the walls of the Soviet PVO command in Moscow, war planners had spent entire careers building this illusion of invulnerability. From the northern Arctic to the deserts of Central Asia, Soviet radar stations were plotted like a massive chessboard, each node connecting to the next, each defense line reinforcing another. To NATO analysts, it looked impenetrable. To Soviet commanders, it felt holy. The belief ran deeper than tactics. It was doctrine. The USSR didn't just build air defenses, they built layers of certainty. High-altitude radar, low-altitude radar, SAM arrays at overlapping altitudes, interceptor squadrons on hair-trigger alert. Even civilian airports were tied into the military grid during wartime readiness drills. And that belief translated into boldness. Moscow dismissed stealth as a Western gimmick. American claims of invisible planes were laughed off as propaganda, terrain-following radar too fragile, precision jamming too unpredictable. The Soviet solution was brute force: flood the sky with radar waves, push the frequency spectrum, track everything from space. But the very scale of the Soviet system was its flaw. It was built to detect mass attacks, waves of bombers, fleets of cruise missiles, formations of fighter bombers crossing through NATO airspace. Their war planning assumed that when America came, it would come loud and fast, It never accounted for a single surgical intruder flying alone, low, and quiet. This miscalculation wasn't just technical, it was cultural. Soviet command was hierarchical, rigid, and prone to self-deception. Officers feared contradicting their superiors. Reports that hinted at radar gaps or low-altitude vulnerabilities were often buried or softened. Radar crews who questioned blind zones were labeled alarmists. Field officers who flagged strange radar echoes at night were told to recalibrate their scopes. And over time, a kind of institutional blindness settled in. One colonel who oversaw Western sector radar operations later admitted, "We measured our effectiveness by how many targets we could see, not by what we might miss." That difference was fatal, because while Soviet planners focused on what their systems could detect, American strategists had spent the last decade studying exactly what they could not. The night intrusion brief, silent, undetected, wasn't just an event, it was a revelation. The sky wasn't full, it was full of holes. And on that night, the Americans had flown straight through one. The Soviet PVO doctrine was built on altitude, speed, and volume. Their planners had spent decades preparing for fleets of American bombers roaring over the North Pole, for massive B-52 raids accompanied by ECM jammers and decoys. They had war-gamed scenarios in which the sky was ablaze with missiles, cruise weapons, and high-speed interceptors. It was a model forged in the crucible of World War II, hardened in the Korean skies, and validated by the shoot-down of Gary Powers' U-2 in 1960. But it was already obsolete. The problem wasn't the hardware. Soviet radars were some of the most powerful in the world. The P-14 Tall King could detect high-flying aircraft at hundreds of kilometers. The S-75 SAM system had proven deadly in Vietnam. On paper, the USSR's defense-in-depth architecture was terrifying. The problem was how it was expected to function. Soviet air defense doctrine was predicated on predictability that the enemy would come in waves, in clear radar signatures, across well-known approach corridors. The PVO believed it could throw up walls of missiles, scramble interceptors from forward bases, and intercept any threat with mathematical certainty. But no war is predictable. The Americans had spent years exploiting these very assumptions. While the Soviets focused on mass detection and vertical coverage, the U.S. Air Force had developed a completely different theory of penetration nap-of-the-earth flight. Using terrain-following radar, aircraft like the F-111 could hug the ground at under 200 feet, weaving through valleys and ridgelines at over 800 kilometers per hour. At those altitudes, Soviet long-range radar systems couldn't see them. Worse, even medium-range sites lost lock. Ground clutter, curvature of the Earth, and signal scatter rendered their vaunted detection network blind. And the PVO had no answer. Their interceptor aircraft were designed to climb and engage at altitude, not dogfight in mountain passes. Their SAM sites were fixed, often optimized for medium to high altitude strikes, and their doctrine still treated low-altitude penetration as a fringe tactic, not a strategic threat. One air defense major general privately warned in a 1981 staff report that terrain is the enemy of geometry, and we've built a system for a flat world. That report was buried. The officer was reassigned. Meanwhile, the Americans kept training. They practiced flying into enemy territory at night, under cloud cover, across terrain where no radar beam could reach. They studied Soviet radar architecture, identified weak zones between coverage lobes, and built aircraft designed not to defeat radar, but to slip beneath it. Soviet doctrine had spent 2 decades preparing for a hammer. But what arrived was a whisper. And that whisper was about to show that airspace sovereignty was just a myth, one engineered by confidence and maintained by denial. The first real breach didn't make the morning papers, not even in whispers within the Soviet military establishment. But behind closed doors in the Ministry of Defense, it was treated like a nuclear detonation. At 03:12 a.m. on a fog-heavy night in late March 1983, a radar station near the Latvian border caught something wrong. A faint blip, just for a moment, appeared traveling west to east, barely above the tree line. The operator logged it, assuming it was a low-flying bird, perhaps a civilian aircraft flying off course. But within 10 minutes, 3 more radar stations spaced across 500 kilometers picked up the same object. No IFF identification friend or foe signal, no transponder, and crucially, no response from the thousands of radar arrays designed to monitor the western approach corridor. For a full 23 minutes, an unidentified aircraft flew deep into Soviet airspace, crossed over 2 military zones, and then vanished near the Ural foothills. No interceptors scrambled in time. No missile crews received targeting data. No anti-aircraft network even went active. It wasn't until an Ilyushin transport crew reported seeing an object flying below them at a ridiculous altitude that alarms finally sounded. By then, the intruder was long gone, dipped below radar again and exfiltrated, invisible, silent, and victorious. The Soviet military called it an anomaly. But inside the high-security facility at Kalinin, where tapes were pulled and telemetry logs dissected, the truth hit like a sledgehammer. This was not an accident, not a glitch, not a ghost. It was a test. One aircraft, one mission, one message. You're not as secure as you think. The Americans had flown beneath their radar net, likely using terrain-following radar, aggressive low-altitude maneuvers, and near-perfect timing. Soviet radar crews had long dismissed the possibility of such an event happening without triggering alarms, but now they had hard proof. The system had failed. Completely. Worse still, nobody could confirm what aircraft type was used. Was it an F-111, a modified U-2 in low observation configuration, a prototype of something unknown? To the men inside the PVO command center, it didn't matter. What mattered was that no one had stopped it. For the first time, Soviet commanders confronted the possibility that a Western aircraft could enter, navigate, and exit Soviet territory without being seen or challenged. The PVO doctrine, unquestioned for decades, was now radioactive. At 0800, the Minister of Defense received the full report. He read it in silence. Then, turning to his aide, he uttered a phrase that would later appear in a classified internal memo. "We have been walking in darkness, and the sky has never truly been ours." The morning after the intrusion, a closed-door emergency session convened at the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. Generals, radar chiefs, and senior PVO analysts filled the room. The mood was not panic, it was disbelief. The official report sat thick on the table. Multiple radar logs confirmed the path of the unknown aircraft. Flight telemetry stitched together a corridor of silence where the plane had dropped below detection thresholds and coasted past 2 air defense zones completely unchallenged. The implications were clear, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, then chief of the General Staff, reviewed the evidence and asked a single question. "Where is the wreckage?" Silence followed. No wreckage, no visual confirmation, no intercepted transmissions. If an aircraft had entered Soviet airspace undetected, someone argued, there should be proof photos, debris, at least a civilian report. But there was none. The easiest explanation was the one Moscow preferred. The radar crews were mistaken. Glitches, atmospheric anomalies, reflections off birds. Perhaps NATO had conducted an elaborate jamming test from outside the border. But the idea that a U.S. strike aircraft could fly hundreds of kilometers across the USSR without being intercepted, unacceptable. Within hours, an internal investigation was ordered not into the intrusion itself, but into the validity of the radar logs. Engineers were sent to check calibration settings, maintenance records, even power fluctuations. Commanders were told to re-interview personnel. They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for a better narrative. Behind the scenes, blame began circulating. The Belarusian sector had recently undergone equipment upgrades. Perhaps the new configurations had blind spots. The radar crews near the Ural foothills had been scheduled for retraining. Maybe operator error had led to over-reporting. But inside the KGB's military counterintelligence division, a different fear was taking root. If this wasn't an error, if this had happened, then the breach had implications not just for air defense but for national survival. A nuclear-capable aircraft, armed with cruise missiles or worse, could have flown the exact same route, and no one would have known until it was too late. In desperation, some theorists proposed the object had been a drone, perhaps a test run, an expendable decoy. But again, no wreckage, no debris, no recovery. What Moscow refused to admit was slowly becoming undeniable to the men actually running the radar network. The system had been outflanked, not by force, not by sabotage, but by design. And in their refusal to confront it, Soviet leadership was sowing the seeds of deeper failure. Because while Moscow dismissed the event, NATO was already preparing the next one. With Moscow unwilling to accept the full implications of the intrusion, Soviet analysts turned to a theory that felt safer: jamming. Electronic warfare had long been a concern. NATO aircraft regularly trained with sophisticated electronic countermeasures. The Americans had deployed airborne jamming platforms like the EF-111A and EA-6B. These aircraft could blind radar, distort return signals, and mimic ghost signatures. It was disruptive, but not invisible. Now, facing an incident they couldn't explain, Soviet High Command latched onto this theory with both hands. Within days, a technical directive was issued: conduct full-spectrum analysis for signs of jamming across all Western radar sectors. Engineers pored over raw data from the night of the breach. Spectrum sweeps were analyzed for telltale noise spikes. Signal-to-noise ratios were recalculated. Dozens of technicians worked through the logs. But what they found wasn't confirmation, it was absence. There were no telltale distortion patterns, no EM pulse disruptions, no frequency harmonics out of alignment. In fact, the data was too clean. No jamming signatures meant one of two things: either the Americans had developed a form of electronic warfare so advanced it left no trace, or there had been no jamming at all. Still, Soviet leadership clung to the idea. It was more palatable than the alternative that their radars simply couldn't see what was there. That idea would dismantle decades of investment, invalidate entire layers of defensive doctrine, and suggest that the Americans now held initiative in the air. Instead, the PVO issued internal bulletins declaring the breach a probable coordinated jamming incursion, suggesting multiple NATO aircraft had spoofed Soviet radar across multiple sectors. In truth, there was no evidence of coordination, no multi-vector intrusion, just one ghost fast, low, and alone. But this misdiagnosis had consequences. Resources were diverted to anti-jamming upgrades. Radar technicians were retrained to recognize electronic fog. Signals intelligence units were told to monitor new NATO bands. But none of these efforts addressed the core issue: the radar net had a blind floor, and the Americans knew exactly where it was. One colonel in the GRU, tasked with evaluating the breach, made a chilling observation in his internal memo. If the Americans are jamming us, then they are brilliant. But if they are not, then we are defenseless. His report was classified and shelved by focusing on an electronic enemy that wasn't there. Soviet planners gave the real threat room to evolve. In basing their response on the wrong theory, they missed the right answer entirely. The radar net hadn't been blinded. It had been bypassed. Weeks passed. Tension simmered beneath the polished concrete floors of Soviet radar bunkers. Nothing had happened since the March incident. No new intrusions, no unexplained blips. And yet, trust in the network had quietly eroded. With the jamming theory growing thinner by the day, Soviet analysts pivoted to another explanation, a decoy operation. Perhaps, they argued, the object detected was never intended to penetrate deep airspace. Perhaps it was bait, an unmanned drone, or specially modified cruise missile launched from a NATO aircraft outside Soviet borders, designed to probe responses. In other words, psychological warfare. This narrative had appeal. It framed the Americans not as stealth masters but as manipulators, testing Soviet reaction times, looking for weak spots to exploit later. A decoy operation implied control, predictability, containment, and most importantly, it explained away the most terrifying possibility that a real aircraft had entered and exited Soviet territory, completely undetected. The GRU circulated a new assessment. According to their analysis, the intrusion may have been conducted by a modified AGM-86 cruise missile or a new type of UAV deployed from a U.S. submarine or strategic bomber. These systems, while low-flying and radar-evading, were not invulnerable. The problem, they said, was positioning. Coverage gaps between sectors had allowed the decoy to slip through, a manageable flaw, a fixable error. But it was wrong again. There were no launch signatures from NATO airspace, no thermal tracks, no acoustic anomalies. Soviet sonar nets in the North Atlantic and Black Sea had detected no unusual submarine activity. And perhaps most critically, the object's trajectory was inconsistent with cruise missile logic. It performed terrain maneuvers that suggested real-time piloting, not pre-programmed navigation. Still, the decoy theory gained traction. PVO Command ordered increased patrols along suspected ingress corridors. SAM crews were drilled to treat small, fast targets as potential missile threats, and a new set of protocols, Operation Zashchita, was initiated to simulate mass spoofing attacks. But again, the real issue went unaddressed. No one asked what if this wasn't a drone, or a decoy, or a test. What if it was the opening move in a new kind of warfare? A senior radar engineer in Voronezh tried to raise the alarm. In a confidential letter to his director, he wrote, "This was no machine. Its flight profile suggests a man aboard, thinking, adjusting, exploiting the land beneath him. That is not automation. That is tactics." His warning was never escalated. Doctrine had already absorbed the incident into a comfortable lie. The radar net, they insisted, had not failed. It had been outmaneuvered by a drone. But deep in the silent halls of the Kremlin, some weren't so sure, because if it hadn't been a decoy, then someone had truly flown through them, and they'd never even seen his face. The Soviet Union prided itself on control. Intelligence wasn't just a tool of state power, it was the glue holding the whole machine together. From the KGB's first chief directorate to the GRU's sprawling web of agents, the Soviet apparatus collected, catalogued, and countered every threat it could name. But you can't stop what you don't believe in. And that was the fatal flaw. By the early 1980s, Western advances in stealth, low-altitude penetration, and terrain-following flight were no longer theory, they were doctrine. Yet within Soviet intelligence, these breakthroughs were often dismissed as exaggerated, or worse, fabricated for psychological advantage. Reports from deep-cover agents in Europe describing NATO experiments with radar-evading designs were frequently downplayed by mid-level analysts. Why? Because Soviet planners had built a system that couldn't afford to acknowledge it. Inside the Kremlin, the very idea of stealth was viewed as a Western buzzword useful for scaring political leaders into budget increases, but not a real battlefield threat. KGB analysts tasked with evaluating the F-117 program dismissed it as a limited, fragile prototype. U.S. claims of radar invisibility were treated as bluff. The result was catastrophic. Human intelligence assets embedded in West Germany and Italy had reported sightings of unusual flight drills, American aircraft flying dangerously low over forests, valleys, and coastlines. Some agents intercepted chatter about invisible runs and black silhouettes. These weren't coded metaphors. They were facts. But when the reports reached Moscow, they were sanitized, summarized, and filtered through bias. Exaggerated Western propaganda. One GRU debrief document read, "Technologically implausible under current radar physics." Another concluded, "Meanwhile, at Ramstein, Aviano, and Lakenheath, American strike pilots trained for the exact scenario that played out in Soviet skies at a secure U.S. facility in Nevada, later revealed to be Area 51, the F-117 Nighthawk was flying sorties under the cover of darkness. Its radar cross-section was smaller than a bird's, its skin absorbed radio waves, and its geometry scattered energy instead of reflecting it. It wasn't invisible, but it was close enough. Soviet SIGINT never caught it. Soviet HUMINT never understood it. Soviet doctrine never accepted it. Even within the KGB's own technical analysis division, engineers who tried to sound the alarm found their research buried. One physicist, who modeled the radar deflection capabilities of angled surfaces, was reassigned to civilian telecommunications. Another was told bluntly by his superior, "We do not chase shadows. We defend airspace." But airspace doesn't care about politics. By 1984, U.S. stealth aircraft had already conducted dozens of simulated penetrations across virtual Soviet lines in war games. In some cases, they reached target zones, dropped inert ordnance, and exfiltrated before any defense system had even activated. Soviet spies sent word that the Americans were practicing for a first strike window, and still no response. The truth is, Soviet intelligence failed not because it lacked the facts, but because it refused to connect them. They had every piece of the puzzle. They just refused to see the picture. And by the time the full silhouette appeared on their radar logs, it was already leaving. It wasn't just a plane. It was a strategy, a complete system of attack that rewrote the rules of air warfare. And while Soviet analysts clung to radar signatures and missile intercept envelopes, the United States was assembling a precision strike machine designed not just to evade, but to control perception itself. At the center of this system was the F-117 Nighthawk, a stealth aircraft that looked more like an alien craft than a conventional jet. But what made the F-117 deadly wasn't its radar-absorbing skin or its faceted design. It was how it operated within a broader architecture, one that fused stealth, electronic warfare, satellite intelligence, and strategic deception into a unified doctrine. This was not improvisation. It was the outcome of Project Harvey, a black-budget initiative launched in the 1970s by DARPA. Its goal: create an aircraft invisible to radar. The Skunk Works division of Lockheed delivered, and what emerged was more than just a prototype. It was a combat philosophy. Every element of the American stealth system worked in concert. The F-117 flew at night, when visual detection was lowest. It navigated with satellite assistance, using preloaded waypoints refined by classified terrain mapping software. Before it entered hostile airspace, USSR electronic warfare aircraft like the EF-111A Raven would jam known radar corridors, creating confusion about its true approach vector. Simultaneously, RC-1-35 rivet joint aircraft would monitor enemy transmissions, feeding real-time SIGINT back to command. Satellites overhead would scan for changes in radar posture or sudden bursts of electromagnetic activity. Ground-based analysts could then adjust flight paths in near real time. No single piece was dominant. Together, they were unstoppable. And then came the weapons. The F-117 wasn't armed with dumb bombs. It carried laser-guided GBU-10 and GBU-27 munitions, capable of hitting within meters of a target. In war games, American stealth aircraft would eliminate high-value targets' radar dishes, communication relays, SAM sites in the opening minutes. Once those eyes and ears were gone, conventional aircraft could fly in safely. The goal was not to fight fair. It was to disable the fight itself before it even began. This doctrine, known internally as First Night Firestorm, was tested rigorously. It required coordination across multiple services: the Air Force for execution, the Navy for escort and deception, the NSA for signals monitoring, and the CIA for on-the-ground confirmation. By the mid-1980s, America could realistically target and destroy a Soviet radar hub within 30 minutes of go order without Soviet air defenses ever seeing the shooter. It wasn't just stealth. It was silence, speed, surgical violence. The Soviet PVO had spent decades building a wall. The US had built a system that flowed around it. One Pentagon planner famously said during a classified briefing, "They're building Maginot Lines in the sky, and we're learning how to walk through walls." When the F-117 finally went public in 1988, Soviet analysts scrambled to reassess everything. But the truth was, the Americans hadn't just outbuilt them, they'd outthought them. And the system that enabled that thinking, the invisible lattice of intel, misdirection, and precise execution, was already in place, long before the USSR even realized it existed. It wasn't a war, it wasn't even a firefight. There were no body counts, no wreckage, no victory parade. But to the Soviet High Command, it was the most humiliating defeat of the Cold War. In the spring of 1986, during a surge in NATO readiness exercises, the US conducted Operation Nighthammer, an ultra-classified penetration drill involving multiple F-117 aircraft, EF-111A Ravens, RC-135 surveillance planes, and satellite-fed command control. Its objective simulate a full stealth incursion across layered Warsaw-packed airspace, targeting critical C3 nodes, command, control, and communication in a mock strike profile. The results were devastating. The F-117s penetrated simulated Soviet radar bubbles, flying below 300 feet, avoiding both long-range and tactical SAM coverage. In the simulation, they reached all target nodes in under 27 minutes. Electronic jammers masked radar coverage gaps, while signal decoys transmitted from Navy platforms in the Mediterranean mimicked conventional air raids to the south. Soviet radar crews in East Germany and Belarus, participating in live monitoring drills, detected nothing. When the results were leaked to the CIA by a double agent embedded in East Berlin, they triggered one of the sharpest internal reactions in the Soviet military since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The mock strike had reached within 40 kilometers of key strategic installations. The simulation even included a strike path toward Kaluga, a nuclear command relay node. There were no alerts, no intercepts, no response. The Americans had proven something brutal: the Soviet air defense system could be entirely circumvented, not by brute force, but by strategic invisibility. Inside the Kremlin, the humiliation boiled over. An emergency review of PVO doctrine was called. Dozens of radar commanders were reassigned. One general believed to have suppressed a 1984 report warning about terrain-following threats was forcibly retired. A memo from the Soviet General Staff warned, "Our defenses protect us from the past. They are useless against what has already passed through them." But the deeper wound was psychological. For decades, the USSR had projected an image of impenetrability. Maps of radar arcs and missile grids were drawn in confidence. The West could be deterred because it was seen, tracked, intercepted. Now that illusion had shattered. A stealth jet flying low, guided by satellites, invisible to radar, had demonstrated the power to walk through fortified airspace, strike with surgical precision, and vanish into the night. It wasn't just a hardware failure, it was a failure of faith. The humiliation spread beyond the military. Politburo members were briefed on penetration vulnerabilities for the first time. KGB officers began investigating whether NATO moles had sabotaged the PVO's radar calibration. One suggested NATO must have installed passive relay nodes inside Warsaw Pact territory to disrupt radar returns. But none of it was true. There had been no sabotage, no betrayal, just a better system. And the most painful truth, the Americans hadn't even needed to use it in combat. They'd won the battle without firing a shot. Because sometimes, humiliation doesn't come from defeat on the battlefield. It comes from realizing you never even saw the war begin. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was still standing, but something within its military doctrine had quietly fractured. It wasn't just a matter of hardware. The S-200 and S-300 SAM systems were still among the world's most powerful. The radar arrays stretching from the Baltic to the Caucasus still functioned. The MiG and Sukhoi fleets still flew. But confidence, the psychological cornerstone of deterrence, was gone. Strategic planners who once spoke of layered air defense zones now whispered about windows of vulnerability. Field officers who once trusted radar sweeps now double-checked visual confirmation. Engineers stopped claiming that their systems were impenetrable and began asking what else they had missed. The intrusion incidents, never officially acknowledged, circulated through the ranks like ghost stories. No one knew how many times NATO aircraft had slipped through. No one wanted to guess, but everyone understood what it meant. The air war, should it ever come, would not begin with missile salvos. It would begin with silence, followed by nothing, until it was too late. More critically, the idea of strategic parity, a founding myth of Soviet military posture, was now under siege. The notion that the USSR could counter every American system with an equal and opposite force had been central to both propaganda and doctrine. But how do you counter something you can't see? The F-117 wasn't just an aircraft. It was proof that the United States had left parity behind and embraced asymmetry. While the Soviets built bigger missiles and denser radar nets, the Americans had turned toward agility, deception, and precision, and in doing so, they had sidestepped the entire Cold War playbook. Within the halls of the General Staff, arguments broke out. Some pushed for crash stealth programs of their own, what would become the MiG-144 and Sukhoi's stealth concepts. Others argued for doubling down on interceptors and improved radar. But the budgets were drying up, the political system was fraying, and the technological gap was growing by the month. Ideologically, it was worse, because if American stealth meant the USSR could be struck without warning, if even the innermost airspace was no longer sacred, then the entire idea of the invincible homeland was dead. What remained was a military machine preparing for threats it no longer understood, guided by doctrines that no longer worked, under leadership that no longer believed. In one final classified meeting in late 1989, a senior air defense general reportedly confessed, "The Americans built a system to be unseen. We built ours to be feared, but you cannot fear what you cannot detect." He wasn't speaking tactically. He was summarizing collapse. And when the Berlin Wall fell months later, many in the Soviet military didn't just see a political shift. They saw the consequences of a war that had never been fought, only lost. Long after the Iron Curtain fell and the hammer and sickle flags were lowered, the stories of the Cold War didn't fade. They simply went quiet, classified, archived, buried in forgotten files and dimly lit bunkers. But among the last generation of Soviet radar crews, one memory refused to die. It wasn't the drills, it wasn't the parades, it wasn't even the political speeches they were forced to memorize. It was the night they realized they'd lost control of the sky. Years later, in interviews conducted by Western historians and defected officers, fragments of that night returned. One recalled staring at a blank scope, knowing something had passed through and being ordered not to report it. Another spoke of overhearing a colonel curse in silence, pounding his fist on the console, muttering, "We've been blind the whole time." Today, the F-117 is a museum piece. Its jagged wings and alien silhouette now hang in quiet halls, admired for what it represented: the triumph of invisibility over firepower, of precision over scale, of innovation over inertia. But for those who once watched Soviet skies, it's not just a relic, it's a ghost. A reminder of a night when the most powerful air defense system in the world stared into its screens and saw nothing. The radar didn't fail. The missiles didn't miss. The sensors didn't break. They were simply bypassed. And in that silence, unseen, unheard, undeniable was the death of an empire's certainty. Because in war, power isn't just about what you destroy. It's about what you make your enemy question. And the F-117 made the Soviet Union question everything.